of programs that you can't get through traditional
Mr. Chair, I just really wanted to say it's about thinking holistically, so it's being comprehensive in how we go about funding our crumbling infrastructure. Thank you very much.
Thank the gentlelady, and let me recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to inquire.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman, and I want to thank you for holding this hearing today. I want to thank all the witnesses for your valuable testimony here today. And my district in central Illinois is kind of a poster child for infrastructure: roads, bridges, rail, locks and dams on the Illinois and Mississippi rivers, and transit. And you can't drive down a road or go across a bridge or navigate your way down the Illinois River without seeing the need for infrastructure. According to the American Society of Civil Engineers, of 10 infrastructure categories, 7 are in mediocre condition and 3 are in poor condition. And my constituents and people all across this country deserve better. And we've heard a lot today from both sides on the need to upgrade our infrastructure. But of course, how do you pay for it? And that's the big issue that we have to deal with. And I think any reasonable person knows that it's going to take a multifaceted approach with the support from local, state, and federal governments, along with the private industry, and partnerships between all of these entities to get it right. And I want to bring attention to one of those partnerships in particular. It's between the insurance industry and those looking to finance infrastructure projects. Not only do I have a heavy ag and manufacturing presence in my district, but I also enjoy representing large insurance companies: State Farm Insurance, Allstate, Country Financial, and Carthage Mutual Insurance Company. The numbers are staggering. Of the $5.8 trillion in investment assets held by insurers, $986 billion are held in municipal securities that are issued to fund our roads, schools, and hospitals. Insurers also directly invest in infrastructure projects, having provided $26 billion, or 6% of all private infrastructure investment in 2016. Insurance companies' investments in these types of bonds create additional demand for these types of financial products, which in turn lowers the borrowing costs for cities, counties, and states to fund highways, schools, and sewer systems. This ends up being a win-win for everyone. Mr. Donahue, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce released a paper just yesterday titled The Role of Insurance Investments in the U.S. Economy. And, Mr. Chairman, I'd like to submit that for the record here today. And, Mr. Donahue, thank you. Mr. Donahue, would you mind providing to the committee a high-level overview of this report and its conclusions?
I'll be very happy to see that such a summary comes very quickly. But to tell you, just in one sentence, when we put together the equation on how we're going to do this, investment by domestic and international insurance companies will be part of the solution.
Thank you. I was wondering if anybody else would care to comment on the role of potential insurance investments would play.
Thank you. The only comment that I would make is if you look at the report that we've done at ASC, we consider all options open, and they do have a great amount of capital that can be brought to bear. Again, at the same time, though, they expect to earn some money and be repaid for that investment. So it's another tool, and as you start to look at this entire equation, you've got to look at all of these and include them.
Thank you. Those are all my questions, Mr. Chairman.
I thank the gentleman, and with that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Washington State, Ms. Del Bene.
Thank you. Thank you. Excuse me. I have the privilege of representing a very diverse district that has both urban and rural areas. Due to the makeup of my district, a very unique set of issues needs to be addressed when we talk about infrastructure. And in addition to ensuring the sustainability and safety of our bridges, roads, waterways, and dams, I'm happy that we're here today discussing how to invest additional money into our crumbling infrastructure, but I'd like to highlight one area that is often left behind, and that's broadband, and in particular rural broadband. It's estimated that 32 million Americans lack access to robust broadband. This is completely unacceptable in a world where the internet is a key driver of economic growth and innovation in all sectors. Rural America is being shut out of emerging opportunities for prosperity and growth created in our modern economy. And in my state alone, there are nearly 366,000 people, my state, which is a technology state, aims as adequate internet service. And, you know, this has an impact on our transportation infrastructure as well. Some of you are talking about the cost that we're all paying for infrastructure, whether it's fixing your car when it hit a pothole or the cost of being in traffic. But there's also a cost of not having adequate broadband. That means people have to make trips they otherwise wouldn't have to take. It means lost opportunities where there's not economic opportunity because a business can't move into an area because the infrastructure isn't there. Mr. DiLoretto, I see in your report that you've given the nation's electricity and transmission lines a D grade. I believe many in my district would also describe access to broadband as receiving an F grade. But in order to solve that rural broadband problem, first we need a complete and accurate picture of the problem. And unfortunately, the national broadband map hasn't been thoroughly updated in years.
I'm not sure I can speak one or the other. We don't include broadband in our report because typically civil engineers aren't doing broadband. And so our experts that do the report tend to be experts in those 16 categories. So I'm probably not the best person to ask.
No, that's fair. Mr. Donahue, what do you feel about rural broadband given there's so many missed economic opportunities there?
We have a responsibility to work to put adequate coverage in the rural areas for broadband, whether it belongs in infrastructure spending of this type or it comes out of requirements on the other industries that are very involved in this, which some exist now, is a matter that's going to have to be discussed. I'm very sensitive from an education point of view and from a medical point of view to this expansion of broadband, and would be happy because we cover all these other subjects to participate in those discussions. I just wouldn't want to say right now this is the place that those funds should come from.
You know, I think rural broadband is basic foundational infrastructure for every sector of our economy. Mr. Trumka, what do you feel about the investment in rural broadband and where we should make, or should we make it a priority, and where should those resources come from?
I think absolutely we need to make it a priority. I come from a rural area, and I know what happens. Experts are now warning of the broadband gap in which rural and low-income communities suffer from a lack of infrastructure to deliver reliable, fast internet, referred to as broadband. So we would welcome that opportunity. And I would just, if you wouldn't mind, just add one other thing. We've talked about infrastructure, but one of the infrastructures we didn't talk about today, and I think needs to be mentioned, is our crumbling school systems. The physical plants of our schools are deteriorating. In Congressman Evans' district, children are going to school without heat, without air conditioning, asbestos, lead paint, and a number of things. We need to focus on that. And generally, it's rural schools who fall behind because of the way those systems are funded.
No, thank you for adding that. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to inquire.
Thank you. I'd like to draw the committee's attention to the need for investment in our freight rail network, and I'd like to address this to Mr. DiLoretto. My district in Southern California sits near the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. 40% of the imports that come from those ports go to the rest of the nation, and 25% of the nation's exports go back out to other countries through those ports. Most of those products then go through freight rail lines through my district in the San Gabriel Valley, one of the most congested areas in the nation. Unless fixed, there are excess emissions, train horn noise, and the potential for collisions. And by 2040, there is expected a dramatic increase. The ports are projected to handle about 35 million units of cargo, which will generate close to 120,000 truck trips per day. That's nearly double the current levels. Of course, we have some that are working on this. The Alameda Corridor East Project, or ACE, is responsible for constructing grade separations to facilitate the movement of all these freight trains through this urban area. They've constructed 19 grade separations, and more than $1.6 billion has been raised by them from regional, state, federal railroad programs and other sources. However, the federal contribution stands at less than 15%, despite the national significance of this goods movement through this corridor. So, Mr. DiLoretto, can you discuss the importance of maintaining and improving freight rail corridors, especially those near our nation's major ports? Is this need expected to grow, and how can the federal government further invest not only directly in freight rail, but also projects like ACE that support the national freight network?
Yes, thank you. Well, in our report card, good news of all the 16 categories was freight did receive the highest grade, grade of B. And those were experts in the freight rail industry that sit on the report card, look at the data that's out there, and analyze it and get a grade. I mean, we have 5 million tons of freight delivering approximately 85.
We have overwhelming gridlock, pollution, and congestion, and that's why we're so excited about expanding our public transit system. While we might be famous for our freeways, we're excited to see the expansion of something called the Light Rail Gold Line, which connects the San Gabriel Valley to downtown Los Angeles and other segments as well. The last segment of the Gold Line added 19 segments to the rail line from Pasadena to Azusa. But what's even more exciting is the greater economic development it spurred. More than 8,500 housing units, more than 2.4 million square feet of commercial development, private sector investment of over $4.7 billion. So, Mr. Trumka and Donahue, can you talk about the implications for job creation and business development when you have these kinds of projects?
It's almost infinite, and it also opens up opportunities. As I said earlier, people that have been disadvantaged and denied those opportunities are forced to live further out of the city. And in order to get there, they need the transportation system. But that happens every single place where we do it. Businesses grow up, housing grows up, economic activity flourishes when you have the ability to get to and from your home and work. So we're very much in favor of improving the entire rail system, but light rail and transit as well.
Mr. Donahue?
First of all, I served on one of the major railroad boards for 22 years, and the answer about the investments by the privately owned railroads get up around $20 billion a year, and you multiply that for a long period of time, and that's why we have the systems we have. The reality that you face in that circumstance is those systems are surrounded by roads, and I'm a realist, and when they bring those projects, we'll look at them.
Thank you.
Thank the gentlelady. I'm reminded that Mr. Trump and Mr. Donahue, they have a meeting coming up in the near future, and if the committee could proceed on that basis, it would be noted. The gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to our witnesses for joining us today. You know, the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act has gotten our economy growing at historic levels. I think we all agree that infrastructure is the key to our future. And in order to support our economy, our education, our national security, and in general, our quality of life. That's why I'm glad we're here today to be able to talk about how we can continue to grow the economy and rebuild the country instead of focusing on hearings and investigations that may not help us move forward. As a representative from Kansas, I'm proud to know that our country continues to benefit from the leadership of President Eisenhower for our massive highway system. And as we meet today, looking at ways that we can work together to provide that same leadership for the next generation of Americans. You know, in the 63 years since President Eisenhower established the interstate highway system, we've made a lot of progress connecting our country throughout roads and infrastructure that wasn't even imagined 6 decades ago. However, as the country and economy has evolved, we must do more to cut the government red tape and streamline the processes to build new infrastructure at a faster and more cost-effective rate. As I mentioned, I believe infrastructure is a key to our economic growth. Perfect example of this, the problem that we have in our country is in the North Junction in Wichita, right in my district, where Interstate 235, Interstate 135, Kansas Highway 254, and Kansas Highway 96 meet. Currently, there's 96,000 vehicles that travel across that annually, including 9,400 trucks, and use that on a daily basis. And by 2050, the Kansas Department of Transportation expects that to nearly double to over 160,000 vehicles per day. The concept has been produced, but we need to actually start construction. We need to move forward with that project. In Wichita being the air capital of the world, a major manufacturer of goods, as well as a producer of agriculture products in the area, we need to make sure that projects like the North Junction work to help not only our city, but also the country. It's also important that we emphasize and recognize that infrastructure doesn't just include roads and bridges. It includes things like water treatment plants, airports. Aside for the Highway Trust Fund should be used as it's intended and focused on improving roads and other transportation needs. We know that the Highway Transportation Fund's the needs have surpassed the receipts since 2008, leading us to have to use some general funds to help maintain that process. So we need to make sure that as we address this, go forward, that we've got a leaky bucket. We need to make sure that we focus on how do we improve the surface transportation, make sure money's used there. I want to make sure I've got a little time for questions. One of the things I mentioned about the Highway Trust Fund, and Mr. Scribner, maybe you can address this, is that while I believe the trust fund should be used as a user fee, I mean, currently we talked about before 20% of it's being siphoned off for non-highway projects. Do you believe there's money should be used for highway transportation as it was originally intended?
Yes, I think and we've seen it occur over time, beginning in the 1970s, but the gradual mission creep in the Highway Trust Fund to fund all sorts of things, some which have nothing to do with transportation. We've seen transportation museum, those assets that are paying and where that revenue is coming from.
One of the other things we've talked about is how do we identify projects of national importance? I mean, do you have some thoughts on how we would do that?
Well, I think the focus should be on moving freight, and that's why I said in my testimony that I don't think mass transit anywhere should be considered a nationally significant project. That isn't to say that the New York City subway system or transit systems, especially in the 6 legacy transit cities, aren't important. They are, but those are local issues, and I think it's important to refocus the federal issues on issues that are truly national.
All right, thank you. I'm about out of time. Mr. Chairman, I'll yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Byard, to inquire.
Mr. Chairman, thank you very much for doing this, and it's fun to be part of this first one in 8 years. I want to state just 2 statements. First, I really want to push back on Mr. Scribner's testimony about the way he characterized spending on mass transit. I think he says mass transit is 28% of that federal highway spending, 5 times what the commuter mode would share, 11 times what it would be with non-commuter and freight. But what's neglected is how many roads and highways are replaced by mass transit. For example, Virginia Railway Express, which runs from Fredericksburg to Washington, D.C., replaces 1 full lane on I-95. I think it does the same on I-66 coming in from Manassas. And that if you somehow, when we have just 1 metro line down, the entire city stops. And you just can't move the trucks or the commuters or anybody else without mass transit. And in fact, if you were to take all the money we put into Metro and try to put it into roads and bridges, there's nowhere to put it. I mean, it just doesn't happen. And which also recognizes that cities like Washington, New York, major cities all across the country that enjoy transit are also not discrete economic units. I mean, what would New York City be without the subway? But those aren't just people that live in New York City. That's the economic engine for the region, the country, the world. And so I think we need to look at this in a really integrated fashion. The second thing I'd like to to just expand on is my friend Tom Reed from New York talked about should we consider general revenue measures? And there seemed to be unanimity that we shouldn't decouple user fees from user benefits. So I'd like to argue that we need to think much larger, that